I never met Jacob Marshak, but he had a direct influence on my decision to become an economist and on the research that I've done over my career. So I'm very pleased to be here today and to memorialize his contributions. I first encountered his work in 1957. At that time, I was a 19-year-old physics instructor at the University of Minnesota, and I thought maybe I would rather study people than build X-ray telescopes, so I applied for an interdisciplinary PhD program in the behavioral sciences. The administrators of that program wanted to know if I was really liked behavioral sciences, so they asked me to take an economics class to see if I liked it. So I did so. I walked into an introductory class in macroeconomics, and my first reading assignment was Keynes' General Theory. I found that book rather wordy. But there was a thin volume that went with it, which made it all clear, distilled it into a few equations. That was Marshak's income, employment, and the price level. And I thought, well, if it's possible to take all this economic talk and reduce it to a few equations like this, maybe it was a subject for me after all. So I decided to go ahead and switch to the behavioral sciences, and I did. Now, actually, I switched into psychology, and I began reading mathematical choice theory. So I read Duncan Luce's book on individual choice theory, and I read two papers by Marshak, one by Marshak and one by Bloch and Marshak on stochastic preferences, random utility theory. I found that the psychologists at Minnesota were not interested in these mathematical choice models, but two economists were, John Chipman and Leo Hurwitz, so I made a final career shift and specialized in economics for my PhD. So that made me a card-carrying economist. I didn't actually work on mathematical choice theory in my thesis, but in 1964, when I had come to Berkeley, one of my students asked me for advice on how to analyze some discrete choice data. I remembered reading Luce and Marshak, and it occurred to me that those could be adapted to empirical work, and so I suggested such an adaptation, and that has become now known as the multinomial logit model, and is turned out to be rather broadly useful. As a result, choice theory has been the focus of my research over most of my career, and my being an economist itself, I attribute both of these in substantial part to the influence of Jacob Marshak. Now, economic theories and ideologies are founded on the principle that consumers have well-defined preferences and consistently behave to advance their self-interest. Jeremy Bentham said, "My notion of man is that he aims at happiness in everything he does." Herb Simon said, "The rational man of economics is a maximizer who will settle for nothing less than the best." Frank Taussig said, "We must accept the consumer as the final judge. In fact, he's willing to give up something in order to procure an article proves that once and for all that for him it has utility." Consumers who know their own tastes and are relentlessly self-interested and self-reliant relish choice and welcome market opportunities that expand these options. Most economists accept this concept of the consumer and the attendant economic theory that demonstrates the Pareto optimality of decentralized competitive markets. Over the past 30 years in the U.S. and elsewhere, these market-oriented views have driven economic policy, leading to deregulation of transportation, telecommunications, and energy markets, establishment of property rights in markets to manage environmental externalities, and globalization of international markets for goods, capital, and services. Deregulation of transportation and telecommunications markets, where dysfunctional regulation worked at cross purposes to competition was successful, as was making air pollution a property right, allowing Coasian markets to internalize environmental externalities. There have also been some striking failures of this broad program of privatizing markets, using markets to solve economic allocation problems. One was the breakdown of the incompletely deregulated energy market in California. Another, the rail transport deregulation in Great Britain that got the incentives for track maintenance wrong. And finally, the British system of private retirement accounts, which had a big problem with excessive fees and overselling. However, the sweep of decentralization and privatization is, I believe, widely viewed by economists as an almost universal success, with the failures due to correctable flaws in market design. Romantics of the economic right would carry the concepts of self-interested consumers and free markets even further, embracing a withering of authority and a nirvana of Hayekian self-reliance. Most reasoned discussions of privatization among economists concentrate on information asymmetries, incentives, economies of scale and scope, risk management, and the relative efficiency and sustainability of alternative forms of market organization. There are serious economic questions as to whether, for example, the technologies of network industries compel concentration with attendant loss of choice and efficiency. There are also serious questions as to whether adverse selection will defeat the efficiency gains from competition in privatized insurance markets. It's a worthy scientific enterprise to study these issues, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I will concentrate instead on the decision-making of consumers, the market outcomes they achieve as a result, and the influence of these outcomes on their attitudes towards markets. We see in the general public widespread unease about market solutions. Free trade and globalization, privatization of social insurance, and deregulation of energy markets elicit opposition from many consumers. A current major privatization initiative, the new Medicare Part D prescription drug insurance program, has opened to decidedly mixed reviews. That program tries to set up a market. It's no coincidence that support for market solutions is concentrated among the economically successful. Free choice has moral appeal, but moral fiber is strongest when it's not cut by self-interest. Market mechanisms have to compete for votes with alternative resource allocation schemes that are more favorable to underdogs. And in this competition, fairness to me is my problem. Economic efficiency is everybody's, hence nobody's problem. In addition, there is ideological opposition to market solutions. In the liberal orthodoxy, markets are dominated by the powerful and rapacious, and the motives of government bureaucrats are purer than those of private bureaucrats. In this ideology, the process of privatization often serves the interests of the politically connected. However, ideologies themselves are woven from human sentiments, and antipathy to market solutions is more than just doctrine. It's not enough to find ways to handle information and technology issues in privatization if consumers are not up to the task of functioning satisfactorily in such markets. The argument is not that consumers should be coddled. They may need to see the stick to get the incentives for self-reliance right. However, the efficiency and stability of an economy requires that all consumers be part of the franchise, in reality and in perception, so that good economic policies, including privatization and free markets where they make sense, receive broad support. In this talk, I'm going to make a selected review of economic, physiological, behavioral, and social studies on consumer decision-making and its influence on market outcomes, attitudes towards markets, and the measurement of well-being. Studies of consumer perceptions, motivations, and behavior give a complex picture of self-interest and the determinants of well-being. Consumers find decision-making uncomfortable. In the words of a Dutch proverb, "He who has choice has trouble." We routinely use procrastination, pre-commitments, habit, imitation, social norms, and superstitions to avoid being overwhelmed by choice. We're suspicious of trading opportunities and fearful of deception, exploitation, and unfair treatment. In short, we exhibit various degrees of agoraphobia, a term that means literally fear of the marketplace, adapted by psychiatrists to mean fear of leaving a safe place for a situation from which it might be embarrassing to escape. Reflect on the major decisions in your own lives, choice of college, occupation, car, house, and spouse. And in most cases, you will feel you made the right choice. I hope that's so. But will recall the choice process itself as being an emotional, stressful experience. By rational calculation, consumers benefit from choice. Then why do they fear markets and find choice troubling? First, there's market risk. Forget the antiseptic, well-lighted markets of economic textbooks. Real-life markets are rough, murky, tumultuous places where commodity attributes shift, supply is uncertain, prices are volatile, and information is imperfect. Caveat emptor prevails, and caution and calculation are vital. The sure-footed may thrive, but their success may come in part from the failures of the less nimble. Second, there are personal risks, including the risk of misperception and miscalculation, of misunderstanding the available alternatives, of misreading one's own tastes, of yielding to a moment's whim and regretting it. Finally, there's social risks, the interactions between people that trade requires, the stress of information acquisition, search and bargaining, the stress of dealing with pushy sales tactics, and the risk of being embarrassed or defrauded. How do consumers deal with these risks, and what is it about these risks that lead to broad biases against market-based resource allocation? One possibility is human psychology. Consumers often have the perceptual illusion that other freeway lanes or supermarket lines move faster than their own, because on the occasions on which this occurs, you particularly notice it and are irritated by it. Similarly, consumers may have the perceptual illusion that they are particularly unlucky or subject to discrimination in markets because their bad experiences stand out. Markets that work well for you are invisible. Those that don't are a source of grief. A good place to begin a review of the new science of pleasure is with the old science of pleasure, the classical economic proposition that choice maximizes happiness. To measure well-being, economists tackled the inverse problem of deducing well-being from choice. I will briefly summarize this approach. Working at the fringes of mainstream economics, Jules Dupuy in 1844 and Hermann Gossen in 1854 deduced that consumers exhibiting diminishing marginal utility would achieve maximum utility by equating across various goods the marginal utility per unit of expenditure. Dupuy was remarkably prescient, recognizing that when the marginal utility of money remained constant, the demand curve can be identified with a marginal utility curve for a good, and showing that the area behind the demand curve then gave a measure of relative utility, or in later terminology, consumer surplus. Dupuy's idea was brought into the mainstream by Jevons, Edgeworth, Marshall, and Pareto at the end of the 19th century, and remains today the standard approach to measuring and predicting consumer welfare. The emphasis on characterizing utility solely by the demand behavior it produced became the centerpiece of neoclassical consumer theory, perfected by Slutsky, Hicks, and Samuelson, and in its purest statement forming the theory of revealed preference. This was a great logical achievement, but the demands of measurement also narrowed and stiffened the way economists thought about preferences. The domain of utility moved from the activities or processes that people had to the commodity vectors that were their consequences. And self-interest was defined narrowly to include only personally purchased and consumed goods. Reciprocity and altruism, which feature prominently in the early utilitarian literature, were now left out. In the days before digital computers, data on consumer behavior was limited and statistical computation was laborious. Consequently, empirical measurement of utility came slowly. One of the first serious attempts was made by Ragnar Frisch in 1932, specializing a framework initially proposed by Irving Fisher. Frisch used 31 monthly observations, beginning in 1920, on income and on the price and consumption of sugar in the city of Paris. In modern terminology, Frisch postulated that the demand for sugar could be written as the inverse of the marginal utility of sugar divided by the marginal utility of money. The Frisch demand function allows the scaled relative utility associated with two different sugar prices to be computed by the Dupuy device. Econometric demand analysis flowered in the 1960s. Oh, by the way, this is the only slide that will have any equations on it today. Econometric demand analysis flowered in the 1960s as improved data and computers made serious empirical work possible. The real starting point was the contribution of Richard Stone in 1954, who worked with demand systems linear in income that were derived from Cobb-Douglas demands translated to allow committed expenditures. The Stone system is a special case of Terence Gorman's polar form demand system, which is shown on this slide. It comes from what's called an indirect utility function of income net of committed expenditure divided by a price index. The Gorman polar form, in turn, can be generalized. It gives to allow more general relationships of demand to income by introducing a monotone transformation of deflated income. That's the last equation on this slide. And I put that down because Frisch's original solution for the analysis of demand for sugar is of this generalized Gorman polar form. In the 60s and 70s, a variety of econometric demand systems were proposed, most derived from Gorman expenditure or indirect utility functions, which allowed the underlying utility to be recovered from estimated demand parameters. So this was a practical implementation then of the idea that you look at demand and solve the inverse problem to infer what utility was, and from that what the well-being was associated with alternative policies. These developments from the 60s and 70s remain the workhorses of applied economic analysis, the effect of economic policies such as changes in tax rates. When they're folded into computable general equilibrium models, these systems allow consistent inference on the impacts of economic policies. As long as one is dealing with policies that act through marginal changes in existing markets, these systems, and as long as one does not look too closely at the behavior of individuals, these models are predictive and provide an adequate basis for economic analysis. As microdata on individuals have expanded, neoclassical demand systems predicated on linear budget sets and representative consumers have proved uncomfortably restrictive. They could not deal easily with preference heterogeneity, acquired tastes, shifting hedonic attributes of commodities, nonlinear budget sets, time, space, uncertainty, and 0-1 purchases. For economic problems where these mattered, it was necessary to expand the domain of the theory. This was done initially by retaining the central elements of the standard neoclassical consumer theory and bringing back some components from earlier utilitarianism. I'll spend some minutes on these extensions because by looking more closely at individual choice, they reveal the limitations of the neoclassical theory and also provide a bridge between traditional economic measurement of well-being and new approaches. These are some of the newer areas I will talk about. The extension of neoclassical consumer theory to handle both unobserved preference heterogeneity and taste acquired as the result of observable experience in history was just a reaffirmation of circumstances admitted in the neoclassical model but pushed aside to facilitate econometric estimation. The primary problems of bringing heterogeneity back are practical: how to fold into the utility function all the varied experiences of consumers, and how to embed within the system and identify the distribution of unobserved components of taste. However, there were also conceptual challenges, such as how much of observed taste variation is a permanent individual effect. Is it possible to untangle state dependence and unobserved individual effects in consumer panels? Is it possible to separate heterogeneity in perceptions from heterogeneity in tastes? Is it possible to recover the distribution of preferences from market-level demand observations? And these are continuing problems that continue to be studied. The neoclassical focus on linear budgets and convex preferences neglected a range of consumer behavior that's apparent at the level of the individual, the lumpiness and mutual exclusivity of many consumer choices, such as school, job, and brand of automobile. Extending econometric consumer theory to handle these applications required attention to the role of taste heterogeneity and to the characterization of budget alternatives. The methods that were very useful in linear budget problems are hampered here, but still valuable. For example, the theory of stochastic utility, first developed by Jacob Marshak, can be applied here and was applied by me, actually, to solve some of these problems. One important observation for measurement of consumer well-being is that nonlinear budget sets are a powerful tool for identification. For example, when budgets are restricted to binary comparison, one recovers preferences directly, that is, if people actually have preferences. Econometricians moved in the 1970s from treating commodities as objects with fixed attributes to hedonic models in which consumers care about generic attributes that can be met through various combinations and quantities of goods. The simplest form of hedonics, dating to Kevin Lancaster in 1966, allowed the hedonic content of a unit of a market good to vary with the design of its manufacturer, and assumed an implementation that these dimensions of content could be measured. Thus, consumers desired power and cargo space in automobiles, and you could array different brands. You could study the implications of modifying brand characteristics. I'm not quite to this yet. Okay. Economists' traditional collection of revealed preference data for market goods can be augmented by experiments on hypothetical market choices, which can be readily cast in terms of hedonic dimensions. This is a method that's in marketing. It's called conjoint analysis. It's adapted in market research from psychophysical roots. And it's tied to market models of stochastic preferences as a result of early econometric work on discrete choice models. In a review of early consumer demand experiments, Ivan Muscati gives an interesting bit of intellectual history. The first conjoint experiment on consumer demand was done by the psychologist Leon Thurstone in 1931 at the urging of his University of California economics colleague Henry Schultz. Thurstone presented his paper at the 1932 meeting of the Econometric Society. Ragnar Frisch and Harold Hotelling were in the audience, and they panned Thurstone's method, and subsequently Georgescu Rogan and Alan Wallace and Milton Friedman also panned Thurstone's method, and it dropped out of economic analysis. There's no mention of it, for example, in Samuelson's foundations. However, the use of hypothetical markets, while it remains controversial among economists with some reason, has turned out to be a very powerful technique in market research. And these methods, which are sometimes also called stated preference methods, have become a proven tool in marketing for designing and positioning new products. For example, experiments on automobile brand choice can determine with good predictive accuracy the distributions of preference weights that consumers give to various vehicle features. This is a case where consumers have something to learn from a subject which perhaps you could say they originated or were involved in, but which they abandoned to another discipline. There's a natural step from hedonics to household production. Consumers may be thought of as obtaining various hedonic quantities through a combination of the hedonic content of market goods and household production of hedonic content. An automobile contains this hedonic content, horsepower, and cargo capacity, and requires the household production activities of driving and parking to facilitate foraging for food. Household production complicates and enriches the neoclassical consumer model. For example, what may appear to be taste heterogeneity or inconsistency may arise from rational accommodation to variations in household technology. Economists have evoked household production ideas in an important way to explain time allocation and facilitating activities like travel and healthcare. Nevertheless, it remains a kind of a starred section in economics textbooks. Despite that, there's potentially a great deal to be learned when it's possible to measure some household activities after the process of household production, that is, between household production and consumption. Knowing something about the specific topography of the hedonic landscape, as in some of the recent work of Heckman, Maskin, and Nessel on demands for jobs with different safety levels, makes it possible to recover the distribution of preferences when consumers operate at active margins. Careful analysis of household production, augmented by hedonic measurement from conjoint analysis, is, in my opinion, a promising frontier in econometric study of consumer behavior. The neoclassical theory of the consumer was extended to explain choice under uncertainty in an elegant and transparent way by Gerard Debreu. He noted that through the simple device of naming commodities by the contingencies under which they would be delivered, one could reinterpret the conventional preference maximizing model so it encompasses risky choices. If contingent markets were incomplete, and they are, these commodities came in bundles that are formally equivalent to lotteries. This theory was enriched by Jimmy Savage, who showed that individuals could have consistent subjective probabilities, and by the Von Neumann, Morgenstern, and Arrow theories of choice under uncertainty, who showed that under plausible axioms, risk-taking behavior could be explained by maximization of subjective expected utility. This theory was broadly successful in explaining risky behavior and remains the core model underlying the theory of financial insurance markets and option pricing. It provides a theory of how consumers will deal with real market risks, such as uncertainty about commodity attributes, price, and supply. Nevertheless, some implications of the theory did not jibe with observations. There's far less trade in lotteries than the theory predicts. People do not seem to be consistent statisticians in forming their subjective probabilities, and their tolerance for large risks seems inconsistent with their worry about small risks. Economists have found some modifications of the original axioms that fit some observations better, but overall evidence has accumulated that choice behavior under uncertainty was inconsistent with the economic theory of consumers as relentless, consistent maximizers. This scientific results call for a full examination of the foundations of economic behavior. This examination has led through physiological, psychological, and sociological studies of consumer choice behavior to a much richer picture of consumer well-being. I'm going to give a very selected survey of this research. This is science in progress, and we're at the beginning of a road whose destination is unclear. It will almost certainly not lead to models of the consumer that are as simple and universal as the neoclassical model of relentless utility maximization. It will go beyond the tinkering at the edges of neoclassical consumer theory that Herb Simon, the Marshak Sr. and Jr., and others, including myself, have explored, in which rationality is bounded by limits in memory, perception, and computational capacity. I think that when we finally get there, this will be a theory which is not just a catalog of behavioral inconsistencies. It will be predictive for behavior in broad arenas. To understand how consumers deal with market, personal, and social risks, it's useful to study how they think. Mind and trade are linked in human prehistory. I'll relate an evolutionary tale which I adapt from Matthew Ridley's book, The Origins of Virtue. A few million years ago, the great apes had established family groups that were successful in the essentials, obtaining food, protecting themselves from predators, and reproducing. In common with other animals, they evolved a sense of personal space sufficient to provide some defense against attack, and a system of trust and reputation that allowed them to suspend their fight or flee defenses and live together with family members. These spatial social interactions had a physiological base, reward pathways in the brain, and neurotransmitters that facilitated social contact, reciprocity, and mutual aid. Some of these apes discovered that through division of labor and trade, they could be more productive and fertile and live longer and better. But trade, particularly outside the family group, was risky business. We get close enough to a stranger to trade flints for furs one had to risk being attacked. The most successful apes dealt with this by developing the ability to form bonds of trust over larger social groups than the family. This was accomplished by adapting the brain's visceral reward pathways that already allowed family units to function. Second, these apes developed analytic, social, and communication skills that allowed them to operate in these larger social groups. These were cerebral activities, and evolution selected species with more cerebral capacity. Now, among these apes were our ancestors. They gave us large brains with the capacity to explore the corners of our universe and to engage in sophisticated economic activities. They also gave us an emotional reward system that processes economic actions in much the same visceral way that it processes personal interactions, when to approach and when to avoid, whom to trust, and when to form professional or personal bonds. The evolutionary tale I've just told is speculation based on observations of contemporary apes and other animals and a few fossil records. However, the role of trust and reward pathways in the brain and how they affect economic conduct is something that we can investigate experimentally at a physiological level using the tools of brain science and the new discipline of neuroeconomics. Brain measurements include maps of energy consumption observed under experimental treatments that alter brain electrochemistry and cognitive tasks. These measurements fall short of Edgeworth's wistful call in 1881 for a hedonometer to record pleasure. He's the origin of the term, the science of pleasure. But they provide some insight into the sensations that economists call utility. The structure of the brain is consistent with a layering of added functionality over a simpler and more primitive core. The aspects of brain function that we identify with being human, language, the cognitive processes of deduction and induction, the ability to empathize and interact with others, are primarily sited in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, the outer layer of the brain whose relative size differentiates us from most other species. The more primitive limbic system buried at the base of the cerebrum is heavily involved in emotion and the reward pathways associated with sensations of pain and pleasure. Its electrochemistry is similar in all animals, controlling approach and avoidance, foraging, territory, and reproductive behavior. And on the evolutionary scale, it clearly predates human development. Now, most people think of economic activity as quite cerebral, learned through lengthy education and shaped by culture. If the brain is the hardware, then the utilitarian calculus might be pictured as software, an operating system that is stored and run at various hardware sites and may be modified, like Linux, by experience and selection. In this view, monitoring the brain can tell you something about the burden the software places on the hardware, but relatively little about what the software is doing. However, the picture that's now emerging is that economic behavior, like the brain itself, has layers. Working a spreadsheet to balance the retirement portfolio is indeed a high-level learned skill. However, economic trading also seems to involve relatively primitive circuits in the limbic system. Therefore, you should not be surprised to learn that brain hardware is associated with economic decisions in a substantial and relatively direct way. Specifically, the limbic system and its reward pathways qualify as the brain's primary center for recording pleasure and appear to be active when we're involved in matters of threat, trust, sex, and economic trade. If you've ever dismayed over convincing students that economics is a sexy subject, you can now tell them that shopping and sex share the same neurotransmitters and receptors. How do organisms process sensations of pleasure and pain? The answer goes directly to the question of whether there's a single absolute physiological scale of well-being or utility, and whether the organism consciously or unconsciously acts out of self-interest to maximize this quantity. Both behavioral observation and brain studies indicate that organisms seem to be on a hedonic treadmill, quickly habituating to homeostasis and experiencing pleasure from gains and pain from losses relative to the reference point that homeostasis defines. People quickly grow to accept the city in which they're located, their job, their mate, and their health status. They may recognize and complain about unfavorable states, but their level of satisfaction by various measures is not nearly as differentiated as it would have to be if sensation was experienced on an absolute scale. Adaptation to homeostasis and differentiation between the pleasure and pain circuits in the brain correspond with powerful endowment and loss aversion effects and sensitivity to framing and context found in behavioral studies, and suggest that these phenomena are tied fundamentally to brain structure. This is good news and bad news for utilitarians. The limbic system reward pathways record pleasure and pain in what seems to be close to a utilitarian scale, but brain circuitry processes experience in ways that are not necessarily consistent with relentless maximization of hedonic sensation. One of the interesting bits of contemporary biology has been the establishment for a variety of species of simple direct links from particular genes to the production of and receptors for specific neurotransmitters, and from this to specific social behavior. One peptide, oxytocin, is particularly involved in bonding and trust between animals, most notably between parents and their offspring. This is relevant to economics because, in the words of Kenneth Arrow, every commercial transaction involves an element of trust. In a study that strikes at the heart of consumer sovereignty, Ernst Freer and co-authors administer oxytocin or a placebo to subjects and then ask them to play the trust game. I imagine most of you know this game. The first player may place funds with an anonymous trustee or second player who, through the experimenter, receives this in a bonus, and then in the subsequent subgame, the trustee may volunteer to send some funds back to the first player. Norms of fairness and reputation matter in games like this, but the rational response in a single-shot anonymous game is to place 0 and return 0. In fact, when this game is played, even anonymously, both the investment and the return are usually positive. In the Freer experiment, investors, first players who were administered the trust peptide oxytocin, invested more than those that were administered the placebo. The conclusion is that economic perceptions and decisions are sensitive to brain chemistry and susceptible to chemical manipulation. So the next time you go to your car dealer, sniff around, or you may be smelling oxytocin. Now, neuroeconomics is a new subject, and the future will determine its potential and limits for understanding economic choice behavior. However, it already seems to confirm and explain that brain structure and chemistry are behind some systematic anomalies in economic behavior, particularly failures to consistently form perceptions and pursue self-interest when confronted with choices involving remote, uncertain, or ambiguous outcomes, with failures to recall or anticipate in full color the sensations that outcomes produce, and the quick adaptation to circumstance, the hedonic treadmill. The biological evidence that the human brain is complex and layered, more of an imperfect meeting of minds than an optimizing computer, follows and supports behavioral evidence from cognitive psychology and experimental economics showing that humans are, well, all too human in the way they retrieve and evaluate information and process decisions. In overview, these studies suggest that Homo economicus, sovereign in taste, steely-eyed, and point-on in perception of risk, relentless in the maximization of happiness, is a very rare species. What we see instead is that consumers are baskets filled with heuristics. Oftentimes, these heuristics work reasonably well. For example, I found it useful to follow two rules: never buy a Rolex from a street vendor, and never accept an email offer to transfer millions of dollars to my bank account. However, most consumers, I think including myself, if you throw them a curveball in the form of a question that fails to fit a standard heuristic for market response, you see some essential irrationality of the organism. Now, what I've just described is the plot line for a horror movie called Stepford Consumers. However, even if this bleak portrayal of consumers is true, it does not mean that policy conclusions based on consumer rationality are wrong, only that the consumer may need to be coaxed and wheedled into responding to market choices with sufficient diligence to approximate rational promotion of self-interest. Most of the evidence on consumer decision-making comes from laboratory experiments. Economists reviewing the experimental evidence sometimes comment that markets punish inconsistencies and consumers learn to avoid them. They then conclude that while these flaws may appear in psychological experiments, they're not important for economic behavior. Now, this may well be true in repeated familiar market settings where the conduct and reward of others provide good examples. However, some consumers are slow learners, and many markets are inconsistent teachers. They don't necessarily provide an accurate roadmap to successful behavior. Furthermore, even if consumers do learn from experience, there's always a fool born every minute, a new mug for the market game. One important point, the sting of market punishment of mistakes may itself breed agoraphobia. Just as children humiliated in the classroom may be turned off rather than educated, consumers humiliated in the marketplace may develop an aversion to markets, where opportunities for choice may be interpreted as opportunities for mistakes, embarrassment, and regret. There are now extensive experiments and insights from cognitive psychology showing that memory is imperfect and perceptions are often biased and statistically flawed. Our memories guide our perceptions of alternatives and our preferences, and imperfections in remembering facts and sensations can distort our perspective, leading to inconsistent behavior and disappointment. What we store and retrieve from memory is affected by mood and emotion. Laura Carstensen at Stanford finds that advertisements are remembered better and influence choice more when the effective content of the ad matches the mood of the consumer. George Lowenstein finds that emotional sensations are more easily remembered than non-emotional ones, but emotions themselves are difficult to retrieve from memory. We remember experiencing episodes of pleasure and pain, and these memories can powerfully condition our behavior, but we cannot relive the experiences in their original intensity. Finding and retrieving information from memory is a complex cognitive task. The answer may be on the tip of your tongue, but sometimes the tip of your tongue is hard to find. We use contemporary cues to guide memory search, and we fill in and bluff when memory fails. Consequently, what we remember is influenced substantially by current context and mood, and these are vulnerable to manipulation in the presentation of choice alternatives. Another memory effect is selective memory. That's the phenomenon in which we remember what draws our attention. Coincidences stick in our minds. Non-coincidences are forgotten. You rarely use the term, "that was a remarkable non-coincidence." This is a selective memory for a coincidence influences probability judgments. A good example is the belief in the hot hand in athletics, the idea that players can get in the groove for some period of time and play consistently above their game. Objectively, the hot hand phenomenon does not exist. The observed distribution of runs of success is consistent with independent Bernoulli trials. not with hot and cold heterogeneity. The explanation is that long runs are coincidences that are selectively remembered. One of the implications of selective memory for market behavior is that people build up elaborate and complex beliefs about causal relationships between events, taking natural events personally and persuading themselves that they are systematically lucky or unlucky in handling market risk. One final memory effect is subjective time. Right, time flies when you're having fun, right? We all have trouble keeping time scales straight in our memories. We telescope time so past events seem more recent than they actually were. We are unsuccessful in integrating sensation over time. And a phenomenon studied by Danny Kahneman and others, episodes of pleasure or pain are remembered selectively in terms of peak and most recent sensation. This can lead consumers to choices that remember better than they experience. There's a relationship between subjective time and brain structure. Current sensation is recorded in the limbic system and its reward pathways. Memory of past and anticipation of future sensations is processed in the cerebrum, more analytic and less colorful. David Leibson and colleagues have studied this as the physiological explanation for hyperbolic discounting. Perceptions and beliefs are influenced by the way we process information. Memory plays a role, for example, selective memory. We overemphasize recent available experience in forming beliefs and depend heavily on readily available cues to construct our perceptions when we need them to make choices. In experiments, consumers are often influenced by the context and framing of perceptual tasks and choices, and anchor their perceptions to cues contained in the choice task. Anchoring affects statements of willingness to pay for public goods obtained by direct elicitation. Also, anchoring distorts responses to factual questions in surveys. Why should economists be interested in this? The answer is that anchoring effects appear clearly in market transactions involving complex commodities. For example, houses and automobiles are typically sold by bargaining, starting from an initial listing price or MSRP. Field experiments show that manipulation of initial offers can influence bargaining outcomes. Another interesting study by Simonson and Tversky finds that when products are positioned so that one appears to be a bargain, a form of anchoring, then consumers will flock to the apparent bargain alternative. I described this study to a friend who owns a seafood restaurant in Boston and said that he could use the result to reposition his wine list and increase his profits. And his response to this was, "Tell me something I didn't learn in hotel school." So this is a real phenomenon. Anchoring is one example of how consumers may be influenced by context and framing that should be irrelevant to choice. A second important example is the endowment effect, also called a reference point or status quo effect, in which consumers show a reluctance to trade away from any position in which they're established. The endowment effect appears in stated preference studies, where willingness to pay for an increased amount of a commodity is typically far less than willingness to accept a reduced amount of the commodity. Some gap is expected due to diminishing margin utility, but experiments show gaps far too large to be explained by classical income and substitution effects. A dramatic illustration of the endowment effect is the now classical cup of experiment of Jack Knish, in which a random assignment of coffee cups in a class, followed by an opportunity to trade, produced a large gap between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. I repeated this experiment in an introductory micro course at Berkeley using pencils embossed with the course name. About half the 345 students, 172, were randomly assigned a chit for a pencil. Then a Vickery sealed bid uniform price double auction was held to reallocate the pencils. In this auction, each bidder has an incentive to report a true value independent of the strategies of others. The income effect of being endowed with a pencil is negligible, so that with random assignment, the distributions of money, marginal utilities of a pencil should be the same for buyers and sellers, and there should be no endowment effect. The ideal rational consumer has the computational power to value complex commodities and consistently handle risk discounting and option calculations, and the logical clarity to work through the consequences of decisions and optimize choices. In practice, both computational and logical skills are limited. This may be inconsequential for short-lived choices such as picking out your breakfast cereal, but these limitations become critical for unfamiliar, not easily reversed choices such as occupation or number of children. The deficiencies are most severe when choice involves small, ambiguous risks in the distant future, as in the case of smoking and other addictive activities, a perfect storm in which distortion of perceptions of time, risk, and affect combined with difficult computations of options and contingencies. I think it's remarkable on balance how well most people function in markets, even those without much academic aptitude. This may be because we're adapted to trade and because we're good at copying successful behavior. Nevertheless, processing deficiencies such as disjunction, the ability to reason through from cause to effect, or innumeracy, the ability to run the numbers, do confuse choice. Ellen Peters at Decision Research studies the ability of people to understand and logically relate numbers. The behavioral evidence is that innumeracy rates are high and significantly distort decisions. Peters and her co-authors find that half the population are unable to read and make sense of numbers in the newspaper. Among those who score badly on a battery that measures basic numerical and logical skills, one finds errors such as altering ratings of risk and choices when probabilities are presented either as number of successes out of 100, number of failures out of 100, or percent successes. You get different responses. In one telling experiment, subjects are offered a prize if they draw a red jelly bean from their choice of bowls. Bowl A contains 9 red and 91 white beans, while bowl B contains 1 red and 9 white beans. So the odds of success are objectively better with bowl B. Nevertheless, subjects who score low in numeracy will choose bowl A because it gives more chances to win. One could be hard-nosed about such people and say that they have not educated themselves sufficiently to look after their own interests in markets. The consequences are on their shoulders. However, the economically unsuccessful can vote, and they demonstrably have used the vote at various times and places to pick bad governments and bad economic policies. This is a strong argument against sink or swim. In designing market mechanisms, it's in society's interest to take a protective interest in this segment of the population, building in information and decision-making aids and protection from market wolves that gives these people a chance of success. Let me turn finally to social risk. Man is a social animal identified with family and kin and with troops, tribes, clubs, and ethnicities and rationalities. This has several consequences for economic choice behavior. First, individuals may look to their social networks for information. Second, they may look to social networks for approval and use social accountability to limit choice. Social norms can be comforting, limiting options and regrets, but they can also lead to embarrassment and agoraphobia. Third, consumers may out of pure self-interest engage in mutually beneficial reciprocity, simple when acts are synchronous, involving more complex elements of reputation and trust when they are not. One major way sociality works is through transmission of information, learning by imitation rather than learning by doing. People constantly make interpersonal comparisons, judging the desirability of options from the apparent satisfaction and advice of others. While personal experience is the proximate determinant of the utility of familiar objects and may be extrapolated to similar objects, our primary sources of information on new objects come from others. Mansky has explored the possibility that individuals faced with a dynamic stochastic decision problem that poses immense computational challenges may simply look to others to infer valuation functions to be used to judge future payoffs or to infer satisfactory policies. An objection to such copycat behavior is that it fails to take account of the individual's idiosyncratic tastes, and correcting this quickly gets the individual back into the computational difficulties that imitation was designed to circumvent. But if tastes as well as perceptions are modified socially, the relevance and value of these lessons from others increases. Economic demographer Hans-Peter Kohler has investigated the effect of information networks on choice. He studied Korean peasant women who have access to relatively little public information on efficacy, costs, and side effects of contraceptives. He found that word-of-mouth communication from friends was the important explanation for most women's choices, not economic variables. Lack of inter-village mobility explained multiple equilibria, in which one village would use almost entirely one method, another village almost entirely a different method. Thus, some apparent taste heterogeneity is due to the boundedly rational practice of imitation in balkanized social networks. Social networks may discipline the behavior of members through consensus on social norms, accountability for choices, and sanctions for behavior that violate norms. The individual gains from affiliation from such networks if imitation and conformity save energy, if the expectations that one will be called upon to justify one's beliefs, feelings, or actions improves one's own decision-making calculus, and if approval is itself a source of pleasure. The classical idea of herd mentality, it's usually used in a derogatory way, but the point is it's not necessarily so, is that social animals find it easier and more comfortable to adhere to a group, accept group roles, and mimic group behavior than to think independently. Accountability reinforces herd mentality and promotes safety through schooling, as fish school. Individual membership may be voluntary, as in the peloton of tightly packed riders in a bicycle race, where the riders tightly clustered and constrained in order to save energy. An implication of accountability is that the success of a market-oriented policy may hinge on its being accepted as a social norm. Reciprocity is a simple form of social interaction present in economic trade and explained by self-interest. Reciprocity is easy to establish when it is synchronous, as in bilateral barter. However, asynchronous reciprocity requires reputation and trust. I pay you today, I take delivery tomorrow. That requires trust. Norms for fair practice and sanctions for bad behavior may evolve in social networks to facilitate asynchronous reciprocity, and individuals may by habit or internalization conform to these norms even in novel situations where the normal cycle of approval and reputation is suspended. Ultimatum game play, for example, is similar in developed countries around the world, with offers near equal division and substantial rejection rates for offers viewed as greedy. These results are consistent with social norms for fairness in which individuals altruistically incur costs to punish greedy behavior. Sam Bowles and a team of experimental economists and ethnographers have conducted anonymous ultimatum game experiments in 15 isolated societies whose ways of life provide a natural experiment on the influence of cultural norms. The findings overall are that cultures where cooperative activity is important, and particularly where people are exposed to markets, induces offers in the ultimatum game that are more equitable. The implication is that social norms for fairness increase in strength with market experience and work at cross purposes to short-run rationality, although perhaps to the benefit of asynchronous reciprocity that facilitates market solutions. Summarizing, physiological, behavioral, and sociological studies indicate strongly that consumers will often fail to reliably promote their self-interest when choices involve risk, ambiguity, integration of experience, or perceptions of remote, unlikely events. Their failures will loom large in their perceptions and may lead to agoraphobia. Market-oriented economic policy needs to take into account how consumers' market experiences and outcomes will influence well-being and acceptance of market solutions. A concrete illustration of the problems that consumers have in dealing with new markets is the new Medicare Part D program that began operation on January 1st, 2006. That program works through private insurance companies, so there's now a market, and elderly consumers have to go to this market and decide what to purchase. Consumers in this population can choose to opt out or enroll in one of the private plans available in their geographic area. This is a large and complex government program. It's a substantial entitlement. It offers substantial insurance coverage. This idea of having a market to provide this was an important part of the Part D legislation, and I think for economists it's an interesting economic policy experiment on whether the benefits of competition can overcome the problems of adverse selection and moral hazard that always lurk in private insurance markets. For economists, it's an interesting experiment. For the elderly, that makes them live in interesting times. In 2004, NIH asked research groups working on the economic aging if they could look at the impact of the Part D program, and my research group did this through a survey that we conducted last November, just before enrollment started. And we wanted to find out what people understood about this program, whether they intended to enroll, and whether that seemed rational, and what the nature of their preferences was. And this is my group of working on this project. And I'm very quickly going to say just a few words about this. This program has a standard plan with an annual premium of $444, a deductible of $250. It covers 75% of prescription drug pharmacy bills up to from $250 up to $2,250. Then pays nothing more until the bills reach $5,100, and after that pays 95%. So it's a combination of a catastrophic coverage plus a sweetener that comes in at low levels. The companies that provide this insurance can offer a variety of enhancements, including forgiving the deductible but at higher premiums, and various other changes in the formularies, the drugs that are covered, and so forth. Enrollees may change plans annually. There are penalties for late enrollment. That makes it an option problem, in which the question is, should you enroll now to lock in a lower premium, or should you delay? And as a result, consumers are being asked to make a relatively complex judgment on whether which of these plans is most desirable, or whether enrollment itself is desirable. A lot of consumers are finding this a difficult choice, and as a result, you're getting headlines like yesterday's headline in the San Francisco Chronicle, which said this is a disaster. It's sort of the Hurricane Katrina of healthcare and the more heated rhetoric of the media. The economic policy question is this: after the dust settles, will most consumers have made good use of the choices offered by this private market, so that a market-oriented design in fact contributes to consumer well-being? Or is further intervention on behalf of consumers needed? And that, I want to come back to that, as that's really one of the purpose of this talk, is to first of all point out that all this new science which suggests the limitations of consumer rationality, and then suggests that there is an important economic research agenda, which is to use this information to improve mechanism design. When you set up new markets, make sure the consumer is on board. Just to give a really quick summary of our results, we find that people don't know a lot about Part D, in particular those with low socioeconomic status and low cognition. More than half have little or no knowledge of this program. We did our own option value calculations. When is it worthwhile for a person to enroll? Here's a figure which perhaps some of you might even find useful. If your current drug cost is more than $800 a year, you definitely should enroll. Now the delaying is out of the money. If your costs are somewhere between $400 and $800, depending on your age, it may well be in your interest to enroll, and if they're below that, you probably would come out ahead by delaying. If you now look at the result of that calculation in our sample versus what people say they intend to do, what we find is that about 10% of the population say they're going to delay, even though it's clearly in their interest to enroll. About 20% say they're going to enroll, even though it's probably in their interest to delay. Now, these intentions themselves will get translated into a somewhat different behavior, because these are intentions to enroll, not actual enrollment decisions. And what will happen is a substantial fraction of those who say they intend to enroll will procrastinate past the May 15th deadline and will fail to enroll. Our conclusions from this study, there are other parts of it, but I won't take time to describe them here, are these. Even when market-oriented solutions to economic policy problems are compelling in terms of technology, information, risk management, and added choice, they need to be vetted to see if consumers can actually handle the decisions that these consumers require. Economic policymakers should not take consumers for granted. They need to build consumer preparation and protection into market mechanism design, and if necessary, they may need to coax consumers to do things that are in their own interest. Finally, here I'll summarize this in terms of research questions that I think that economists should work on, particularly those who are enthusiasts for market solutions. Most economists prefer market solutions unless there's an argument that they don't work. But now the question is, particularly if that's your predilection, then these are research questions you really should answer. How can are consumers sufficiently consistent in advancing their self-interest in specific markets, such as Medicare Part D, to achieve the levels of efficiency and well-being that privatization promises? What can be done as part of the design of privatization, such as information, instruction, and support, to help consumers satisfactorily pursue their self-interest? And finally, when privatization is in the consumer's self-interest, how can they be convinced of that fact? Thank you.